The Earl of Pemford had been back in London for 9 days when a stranger at a literary dinner told him the one thing that unmade him completely. He had been doing what he did beautifully in those rooms, which was holding a glass and saying the right things about the right books to the right people, moving with the particular ease of a man who has never once feared that his opinions might be found wanting. He was 34 years old, the Earl of Pemford, and he had been raised to know what was excellent. His library was spoken of, his taste was deferred to. When Callum Pemford pronounced a book significant, the literary pages of 3 periodicals found it so within the fortnight. He had paused beside Mr. Arthur Doverley, the critic, because Doverley had said something interesting about the season's most discussed novel. The second from the author published as A. Finch, a book that Pemford himself had championed in print 6 months prior, calling the prose the finest moral intelligence at work in the English language today. He had meant it. He always meant the things he said about her work, which was not always the case with the things he said at literary dinners. "You admire the work," said Doverley, watching him with the particular alertness of a man who collects contradictions. "Enormously," said Pemford. "There is a passage in the 3rd chapter, the garden scene at dusk, that I have read 11 times and not yet finished admiring." "Then you must be gratified to know," said Doverley, with the light, pleased air of a man delivering news he has been saving all evening, "that the mystery seems at last to be resolved. A. Finch writes from somewhere in Dorset. A village, they say, refuses all invitations, receives correspondence through a solicitor, sends manuscripts by post, will not be drawn to London on any account. The name, Finch, is a Hampshire name, I'm told. Your part of the country, Pemford, is it not? You must know something of her." And the Earl of Pemford stood in a candlelit dining room in London, with a glass of wine going warm in his hand and the conversation washing pleasant and irrelevant around him. Because A. Finch of Dorset, the author whose prose he had called the finest moral intelligence of the age, was not someone he knew something of. A. Finch was Miss Audrey Finch, his own betrothed, whom he had installed 18 months ago at his country estate in Dorset, with an allowance, a companion, and a letter that he had spent 3 evenings composing in the confident belief that he was being exceptionally kind. I am going to stop us right there in that dining room, with the Earl of Pemford discovering from a stranger, at the very centre of the literary world he had been so carefully afraid his quiet fiancée would embarrass him in, that the woman he had exiled to the countryside to improve her conversation had spent the time giving the whole country something worth saying. Before I tell you what was in that letter, and what Audrey Finch did in the 18 months after she read it, and what it cost a very polished man to earn his way back into a life that had grown so magnificently in his absence, you and I have our arrangement. The subscribe button sits just below this video. It is free, it takes a moment, and it means the next story reaches you the instant I am ready to tell it. And I am always ready, and they are always worth the having. If you will not subscribe, then you owe me one, and I am very patient about what I am owed, and I never forget a debt. This is a story about the difference between a reputation and a voice, and how a very intelligent man spent 18 months confusing the two. And I promise you it is worth every minute of the telling. Come back now, and let me show you exactly how it began. The betrothal between the Earl of Pemford and Miss Audrey Finch had been arranged, as such things often are, between 2 men who meant well and did not consult the 2 people most affected. Pemford's father and old Mr. Finch had been colleagues in the way that scholars and aristocrats sometimes become colleagues, over books, over the particular fellowship of men who care about ideas more than about rank, when Mr. Finch's small Hampshire property came under pressure. In his last illness, the late Earl had settled a portion of the debt in exchange for a promise made in the old fashion, his son to marry the Finch daughter when both were of age, the connection to bind the 2 families. It was not a cruel arrangement. No one was coerced, and no one was ruined. But it meant that Callum Pemford inherited along with his earldom, a fiancée he had met perhaps 4 times in his life, and a responsibility he had treated, in the busy years of his early 30s, mostly as a thing to be eventually addressed. Audrey Finch was 28 when the promise came properly due, and I want to describe her to you with care, because the word the world used for her was quiet, and I want you to understand what that word was quietly doing. She was not a social ornament by any measure that London kept. She did not fill a room when she entered it. She did not glitter in conversation or angle for attention, or make the careful calculations that clever women in society make in order to be found charming by the right people. Her father had raised her on books and given her his own habits of mind, which were precise, patient, and deeply disinterested in impressing anyone, and she had grown up accordingly. She listened more than she spoke. When she spoke, she said what she meant, and meant it exactly, without decoration. She had read more books than most men in Pemford's literary circle and had opinions about all of them that were more interesting than 3/4 of the opinions she encountered in print. She had been writing quietly in her father's study and then in rooms of her own since she was 19 years old. None of this was visible at a dinner party. What was visible to a man carrying London in his head was a woman who stood in a Hampshire drawing room with good posture and no fashionable conversation to speak of, who wore a plain grey dress maceardover from something of her mother's, and who had the steady grey eyes of someone listening to you, rather more carefully than was entirely comfortable. Callum Pemford saw the dress and the silence and the careful eyes, and he heard, underneath all of it with the perfect clarity of a man who has built his entire life around the management of other people's opinions, he heard exactly what Lady Rosamond Fitch would say. Lady Rosamond Fitch was the ruling wit of the literary set Pemford had moved in since his early 20s. A woman whose tongue was a precision instrument, and whose approval everyone wanted, and very few received. She had met him at a gallery 2 winters prior, when the engagement was a thing known to a small circle and mentioned in none of the papers, and she had said to him over champagne, and with the bright particular smile that meant she was aiming, "Tell me, Pemford, is it true you're promised to some Hampshire rector's daughter? How pastoral! Do bring her to town once she's finished with the apple harvest. We shall all be perfectly welcoming, I assure you." And the room had laughed, the easy laughter of people who have never been its subject, and Pemford had laughed too. I will not spare him that detail, because it is the detail the whole story turns on, and he could not spare himself. He had told himself in the years that followed that the laugh was protective, that he was keeping Audrey at a distance from people who would eat her alive. It took him the entire length of this story to understand that a man who hides a woman from cruelty he hasn't the spine to correct is not protecting her, he is endorsing it. So he visited Hampshire. He spent 4 days being impeccably charming at a woman he was too frightened to actually see. He talked about books carefully, in the way one talks about books when one is performing rather than thinking. He noticed she listened to everything. He did not ask what she thought. She read him, I can tell you this plainly, with the unhurried accuracy of someone accustomed to going straight to the center of a thing. She saw the performance for what it was, the careful arrangement of surfaces, polished to such a shine that nothing real could get through. She saw underneath it something that surprised her into something other than simple hurt. She saw fear, the same fear that makes a man polish everything he touches until nothing can reach him. And she felt, along with the sting of being so transparently unseen, an unexpected thread of something like pity. Under the pity, to her own considerable surprise, a flicker of interest. Because there was one afternoon, the 3rd day, when it rained and the performance lapsed, and he talked for a long hour about a manuscript he had read that had moved him, actually moved him, and his voice was different then. Lower. Real. She thought, there he is. That is who he might be, if he could ever manage to stop trying so hard. And then the rain stopped, and he collected himself, and 2 weeks later came the letter. I will give it to you at some length, because its particular damage is of the kind that wears generosity as a disguise, and you should feel the full weight of it as she did, and the unmistakable air of a woman. That he had returned to London with the warmest impressions of their acquaintance, and that he was more than ever sensible of the honor the connection represented. And then he wrote. In sentences he had revised over 3 evenings, with a good fire and a glass of port, and no one to tell him that what he was doing was not generosity at all, that he was persuaded she would share his view that the timing of their formal announcement ought to be governed by prudence, that London's literary and social world carried particular expectations that it would be unjust to subject her to without proper preparation, and that he proposed therefore that she make use of his estate in Dorset. Barton Hall, fully staffed, every comfort provided, where an allowance suitable to her future position would be settled at once, and where a Mrs. Peel, a woman of wide experience in letters and society, would join her as companion and guide, so that she might have time. And here is the sentence, my dear listeners, the one she read twice and carried the rest of her life, so that she might have time to find her footing in the world that will be expected of her as the Countess of Pemford, which I am confident, with patience, she will achieve beautifully. Read it in a hurry, and it is all solicitude. Read it as Audrey read it, twice, slowly, with her father's habit of reading for structure rather than sentiment, and it says exactly what it says. You are not ready to be seen with me. I am embarrassed by you. I am placing you at a comfortable distance from my real life until someone can improve you into something that won't cost me anything, and I have hired a woman to do it. And I have not the courage to say this plainly, so I have dressed it as a kindness, and I expect to be thanked for my trouble. She did not cry. Her aunt, who was visiting, reported afterward that Audrey read the letter twice, set it face down on the table, was silent for perhaps a full minute, and then said a thing the aunt did not entirely understand until much later. What she said was, "He has sent me to find my footing. Well, I have always known where I stand." And then she did not laugh as another woman might. She simply became very still in the way that certain people become still when a decision has been made below the level of words. She wrote back in 3 lines. She accepted the arrangement. She thanked him for the consideration. She asked the date of the carriage. Then she began to pack her notebooks. Because here is what Callum Pemford, Earl of Pemford, celebrated champion of fine letters and self-appointed arbiter of the age's best prose, here is what he could not have known, having never once asked her a question that wasn't about the weather. He had just sent to an empty house, with a generous allowance and unlimited hours, the best writer in England. And he had told her in writing that her occupation until further notice was to think about words. She arrived at Barton Hall in November and found it precisely as promised. Large, well-maintained and empty, and she found Mrs. Peel waiting in the entrance hall, which was where the first surprise lived. Margaret Peel was 60 years old, and had spent 30 of them at the margins of the London literary world, editing manuscripts that appeared under men's names, placing novels through agents who took the credit, writing the correspondence that built the reputations of 3 celebrated authors, who had never once publicly acknowledged the hand behind the work. She had retired to Bath after her husband died and had taken Pemford's commission, polish my fiancée, teach her how to converse. Partly for the income and partly out of curiosity about a woman, a man like Pemford felt the need to hide away. What she found on the first evening at Barton Hall was Audrey Finch at the long library table, with 4 notebooks open and a 5th on her lap, not reading but writing. Writing the way people write when the words have been waiting a long time for enough quiet. Mrs. Peel sat down across from her without being invited, waited until Audrey looked up and said, "I was sent here to improve your conversation. I would like to propose instead that you tell me what you are actually writing, and we begin from there." Audrey looked at her for a long moment. Then she closed the notebook in her lap and said, "Sit down, it will take some time." It took 3 evenings. At the end of them, Mrs. Peel understood that she had come to the country expecting a pupil, and found instead a colleague, one of the rarest kind. What Audrey Finch could do with a sentence were not things that could be taught. They had been grown slowly. In the silence, Pemford had mistaken for emptiness. What Audrey wanted, what she had wanted for years, filling notebooks in rooms where no one knew to ask, was simply to publish, to have her work read. She had stories about women that women had never had the opportunity to encounter, because the women who could write them had been, by and large, kept too busy finding their footing to write. She had a finished novel, a second one halfway done. She had a voice entirely her own, quietly perfected over 9 years in rooms no one had thought to look into. "Send it," said Mrs. Peel, who had spent 30 years watching women's work disappear into other people's names and had decided some time ago that she was finished with it. "Send it under your own name, not a pseudonym, not initials that could belong to a man. Miss A. Finch, your name, plain and whole, on the cover. Let the work answer for itself." "You will not hide," she said when Audrey began to object. "Not while I keep the correspondence. The world is going to know, for once, exactly whose mind it is reading." Audrey sent the manuscript in January. The response came in March, and then everything changed, at a pace that surprised even Mrs. Peel, who had seen a great deal and was not easily surprised. I will not stretch the middle of this story, because you can already feel its shape, the novel spreading through lending, libraries and drawing rooms, the name Miss A. Finch appearing in the literary columns with increasing astonishment, the second book accepted before the first had finished its first printing. What I will tell you is this. By the second autumn at Barton Hall, it was not possible to attend a serious literary gathering in London without someone mentioning A. Finch, and the man who mentioned her most often, most admiringly, with the greatest enthusiasm and the most confident pronouncements, who had written in print that her prose represented a moral intelligence this generation has not previously had occasion to encounter, was Callum Pemford, Earl of Pemford, who had been championing the author for 8 months and had never once connected the name to the woman he had sent away to improve her conversation. He had never asked her what she wrote. He had never asked her anything at all. Now find the subscribe button beneath this video and press it, because I have been keeping something from you and it is time to go back. It is free and takes no more than a moment, and it means you will not miss what comes next, which is always the best part. If you will not, well, you know what I am going to say. You owe me one. I am patient. I am always patient. Press it and come with me back to London and then south on a long road to Dorset. He made the journey the morning after the dinner, alone, having slept not at all. I want to be honest about what kept him awake, because it speaks better of him than it might first appear, and he deserves the credit. It was not, or not mostly, the embarrassment, though the embarrassment was real and would be considerable. The literary world he had so carefully cultivated would dine on this particular irony for years. The man who championed A. Finch, who called her the finest moral intelligence of the age, who sent her away to find her footing. What kept him awake was the letter. He had recalled it sentence by polished sentence through the whole dark night, and he had read it this time without the satisfaction that had surrounded its original composition. He had read it the way she had read it, looking for structure rather than surface, and it had made him feel something he recognized after a long moment as shame. Not the social kind, not the fear of being found out, the deeper kind, the kind that means you have looked clearly at what you did and cannot find a comfortable angle from which to look at it again. He arrived at Barton Hall on a grey Tuesday afternoon, and the house taught him his first lesson before he ever found her, because Barton Hall was alive. He had left it a maintained and empty building, expensive and quiet as a museum. He walked into a working establishment. The drawing room had been given over to a long correspondence table. The library was in daily use, every surface occupied with purpose, 3 sets of handwriting on papers stacked near the door, an air of settled industry, so plainly of long standing that he understood, standing unnoticed in the entrance hall of his own property, that he was the stranger here. This place had a life. He was not in it. She was in the library, writing. She looked up when he came in, and she was exactly as he had left her. The same steady grey eyes, the same undecorated presence, and entirely different, because the difference, he understood now with a slowness that pained him, had never been in her at all. "Lord Pemford," she said with perfect composure, "I wasn't expecting you." "I know," he said. "I didn't write ahead. I wasn't certain I'd earned the courtesy of a reply." She set down her pen. She waited. He had prepared a great many speeches on the road south, and had discarded all of them, one by one, in the grey morning light, because every version of it was arranged. Every version was constructed to present him in the best possible light, to control what she thought of him, to manage the outcome the way he had spent his entire adult life managing every outcome. And he had decided, somewhere on the road out of London, that he was finished with his own arrangements. "I reread the letter last night," he said. "The one I sent you. I haven't read it since I wrote it, and I was proud of it when I wrote it. I want you to know that, because it is the part I am most ashamed of. I thought I had been very careful and very generous. I read it last night, and it said none of those things. It said you were a problem I was managing from a comfortable distance, that I'd hired someone to correct you, and that I expected gratitude in return. And I wrote it about a woman whose work I have spent 8 months calling the finest prose of the generation, and I didn't have the wit to know it was hers, because I had never once asked her a question that required a real answer." He stopped. "Then I'm not here for absolution. I haven't earned it. I'm here because I stood in a room last night and understood, for the first time and all at once, that the most extraordinary thing I have ever had any connection to, I had placed in that connection myself and then walked away from, and I am not certain of this, and I am not asking you to make me certain. I think there may be a man somewhere underneath the parts of me I have spent 30 years arranging for other people's approval. I would like to find out. I am only asking whether you will allow me to try." Audrey was quiet for a time. The afternoon light was going thin and grey in the windows. "Sit down," she said at last. "I'm going to tell you something, and it is not what you are expecting." He sat. "That letter," she said, "was the worst thing anyone has done to me. I want that said plainly before anything else. There were nights that first winter when I was angry at a pitch I hadn't previously known I contained, and if you had come then, I would have closed the door." She paused. "But I am going to tell you what else it was, because you have been carrying it as a pure wrong, and you are owed the full account." She folded her hands on the desk in the manner of someone who has thought about something long and arrived somewhere solid. "It was also Lord Pemford, a house, and an allowance, and 18 months of uninterrupted hours, and the instruction, in your own handwriting, to find my footing in the world. And I chose to interpret the footing literally. I chose to stand on it and find out what I could build from there." She glanced toward the window. "Every woman I have known has been given some version of what you gave me. Be less, be quieter, be more suitable. Most are given it without the house or the time, or a woman like Mrs. Peel at the table. I was luckier in my insult than anyone I have ever met, and I made use of every inch of the luck." She looked back at him. "That does not excuse the insult, but it means I cannot hate you without complication, and I gave up trying some time ago, which is more ground than you have earned. But there it is." She held his gaze with the grey, clear directness he had once found merely steady, and now recognized as the clearest thing he had ever been looked at by in his adult life. "You asked to try," she said. "Here is what trying looks like. You are not in this house, the Earl of Pemford. The title is not useful here. There is correspondence to manage, accounts to be kept, and a new manuscript that needs an honest reader. Someone who will tell me when a chapter is not working, without softening it because he is afraid of me. If you can do those things, plainly, without performance, I will see what I see. I make no promise beyond that. I am not a reward at the end of a season's effort. And this is not a test with a wedding at the close of it. But I will not close the door. She picked up her pen. Mrs. Peel will show you the correspondence room. Start with whatever is oldest. He stayed. That is the first thing, and do not count it lightly. Men of his particular kind, when refused the quick redemption, mostly do not. He took a room in the village, because his instinct, for once a reliable one, told him that occupying his own house while being readmitted on sufferance was precisely the wrong kind of comfort. And he presented himself at Barton Hall each morning, and did what was asked of him. He was not good at the correspondence at first. He was very good at it by March. What he discovered, once the performance had no room left to live in, was that he was genuinely useful. A man raised to manage a great estate, once stripped of the management of impressions, turned out to have a practical mind the work actually needed. He handled a publisher's contract that had been written with considerably more care for the publisher than for the author. He caught, buried in a month's correspondence, a quiet campaign by a competing publication to claim prior rights over 2 of her essays, and he dismantled it with 3 weeks of patient, entirely undramatic legal work, not by deploying his title but by reading every document in the file and knowing what a contract actually said and what it did not. He read the manuscript chapters she gave him and said what was true about them. She pushed back on 2/3 of his notes and was right about 2/3. He told her so. And when the new publishing agreement came to be drawn up, the one that established Miss A. Finch as the sole and irrevocable author of all past and future works, the one that specified in plain binding language that no third party, including any future spouse of the author, could claim editorial authority, assign rights, or alter the terms of the agreement. She found the document on her desk one morning with one thing written on it besides the legal text. His signature, already there, and a note in his hand in the margin that said, "I asked them to put it in because it was right, not because I expected you to notice, but I thought you should have it to keep." She sat with that paper for a very long time. Through the window she could see him in the garden, with a stack of page proofs, reading in the thin March light, with his coat done up against the cold, looking not at all like an earl, and entirely like a man who had found, after considerable searching, the work he was actually meant to do. Mrs. Peel passed the open doorway, saw Audrey sitting there, saw the paper in her hand, and said nothing. She smiled all the way down the corridor. On an evening at the end of April, on the same garden path where she had first laid out her terms, she stopped walking and looked at him for a long moment in the last light of the day. The page proofs under his arm, his hands ink-stained from the afternoon's work, the high finish of him worn down through a long winter to something she found infinitely preferable. And she said, "The work you have done here has been honest. I have looked for the performance in it all season, and it is not there. If you still wish to ask me something, you may ask me now, and ask me plainly." The Earl of Pemford asked Miss Audrey Finch to marry him in very few words, several of which came out in the wrong order, and she counted that in his favour, and her answer was yes. They were married in June, in a Hampshire church, and I will give you 3 details, because they are the ones that lasted. The first novel was reissued for the occasion with a new edition page, Miss A. Finch, now the Countess of Pemford, and the price was kept precisely where it had always been, because Audrey said that a book which had begun by belonging to everyone should not change its terms on the occasion of its author becoming a countess. Mrs. Peel kept the correspondence until the end of her long life, at exactly the terms she and Audrey had established in that first winter at Barton Hall, and she refused every offer that did not meet them, and the Countess of Pemford's books went on being read by everyone from drawing rooms to the back shelves of lending libraries to the reading circles of working women in a dozen cities, which was precisely as Audrey had always intended. And Lady Rosamond Fitch, since you have been wondering, and you are entirely right to wonder, I told you at the beginning that I never forget a debt, Lady Rosamond Fitch had spent the better part of 2 years declaring to every salon in London that Finch was the only author she bothered with anymore. That the prose was devastating, that it was the only work she had encountered with the courage to say true things about women in language that actually trusted the reader to think. She said all of this with great enthusiasm and considerable volume, and to very large rooms. She never learned, for the Countess of Pemford was graciousness itself in company, and Mrs. Peel's correspondence files were sealed. That she had been saying it about the woman she had once described, over champagne at a gallery opening, as that quiet little Hampshire mouse Pemford is stuck with. The Countess had known about that remark for years. She had been told of it by a mutual friend who had been present. She had done nothing with the knowledge except, on one particular occasion, accept Lady Rosamond's commission for a signed dedication copy with especial warmth, and write inside the cover, in her own hand, the thing she had long wanted someone to say in the rooms where such remarks were casually made. For Rosamond, the best readers are always the ones who arrived a little late. Welcome. If you ask me what this story is truly about, I will tell you it is about the two different kinds of silence, and how easily they are confused from the outside. There is the silence of emptiness, the silence of a room with nothing in it, and there is the silence of accumulation. The silence of a room where the work is happening, where the pages are filling, where what is being built is simply not yet ready to be shown. Callum Pemford looked at Audrey Finch's silence and heard nothing. He was wrong in the way a man can only be wrong, who has spent so long producing sound that he has forgotten entirely what it means to listen. Audrey Finch was never quiet. She was paying attention. She was, as the best writers always are, simply waiting for enough room, and when she was given that room, even wrapped in an insult, she was too clear-eyed to pretend was anything else. She did what she had always been going to do. She wrote. The man who gave her the room did not deserve her. She knew it. He eventually came to know it too, which is the beginning, I have always thought, of everything that is worth beginning at all. If you have sat with me through this whole long evening, through a well-dressed letter and a November library and a garden in the April light where a man finally said what he meant without polishing it first, I hope it has given you something to carry home. A warmth, perhaps, or the quiet reminder that the people around you who say the least are not always the ones with the least to say. They may simply be waiting for someone with the patience to ask. Subscribe to Moonlight at Marlowe before you go. There is always another story waiting by this fire, and it is always worth the having. It costs you nothing, and it means more than I can say from this side of the hearth, and if you will not, you know. You owe me one. I have been keeping this fire lit a long time, and I never let a debt go quietly uncollected. Come back to me soon. And the next time you are certain that someone has nothing to say, do stop a moment, won't you, and consider whether the silence is in them, or in the ear that has never once thought to listen for them. The finest prose in the world has been mistaken for nothing by every reader who only skimmed it. It goes right on being the finest prose. It is only waiting, patient as stone, for someone who finally knows how to read.